Okay, chapter 12, predation. Things eating other things. The key concepts for this chapter are most carnivores have broad diets, whereas most herbivores have relatively narrow diets. And of course, there's exception to any rule, but generally based on the rules and principles we've already learned about as far as optimal foraging theory and encounter rate of prey in handling time. Predation results in a wide variety of capture and avoidance mechanisms, kind of an arms race we'll talk about. And predator populations can vary with their prey populations, and predation can affect prey distribution and abundance, in some cases shifting from one community to another. The chapter starts off and ends with this classic snowshoe and hare case. And it's kind of interesting because it has a historical ecology component as well of looking over pelt records from the Hudson's Bay Trading Company, which generally track the abundance of hares. There's a layer there in that engaging in the fur market can be a bit more of like a luxury item, depending on how you need to allocate your time to pursuing food. But in general, there's this like interesting cycle between lynx and snowshoe hare. Biologists use these records to study lynx and hare population cycles. This is lynx there. Populations peak about every 10 years, rising and falling in synchrony across regions of Canada. And hare reproduction and survival rates reach the highest levels 2 to 3 years before the hare density peaks, and the lowest levels 2 to 3 years after hare density peaks. So it's kind of an interesting pattern. Here is the top is population of hares in thousands, and then thousands of lynx in blue. So you can see there's generally kind of a synchronous nature here. When hare populations increase, so do lynx, and on this kind of decadal time scale. Some variation in amplitude, but generally, in the world of ecology, a very strong signal. And bringing in the pelt data is pretty interesting because, if this is a 10-year cycle, the career of any one ecologist, it would take them, their entire career of monitoring hare and lynx populations to build this kind of data set, right? If you start today, 10 years later, you would only really have one cycle. And you'd really want 3 to be able to say anything about these dynamics. And so this data set's really, really powerful, and then it can be augmented by looking at hare density here. Hare density. Why are these? Man, it looks like a different color to me, but I don't think it is. Reproductive rate of females, number of young per year. This is hare density here. This looks like a different color to me, but the solid line being the overall hare population, and then basically the reproductive rate or the fecundity per year of females. They can have a massive number of young, 3 to 4 litters a year, and up to 5 or so individuals per litter, just enormously productive. And so you can see this productive rate, number of young per female per year, is quite striking. And the population peaks, and in pre-peak, you start to see this decline of reproductive fitness. But the interesting thing is, after the population declines, you don't see a really quick increase. There's an increase, but there's a lag of a few years, which is kind of interesting because you would think, as density is dropping, if it's food limited, those food resources would then become more available, and then that would compensate for the population. But even post peak, there's still a depression in the number of young per female. So we can look at 2 different hypotheses here. The first one is that food supplies become limiting when hare population density is high, which makes sense. But some declining hare populations don't lack food, and the experimental addition of food doesn't prevent a decline. So you can look at in different populations through space and see some populations that are declining despite not reaching the carrying capacity for that particular ecosystem, or you can augment with food and not see a decline. So it's more than just resource limitation. The second hypothesis is that predation by lynx and other predators can explain the drop in survival rates, which could make sense, but hare birth rates drop during the declining phase when you would expect them to go back up. And hare numbers rebound slowly after predation numbers plummet. The physical condition of hares worsen as hares decline in number. So even though there's this declining population, their condition is still quite poor, which you would assume that when populations decline, there's more abundant resources. And so it's a kind of a complex story. And we come back to it at the end of the chapter. I'm trying to figure out where I put me where I don't block it here. So a few definitions that are pretty straightforward, and then the next slide has some that are a bit funnier. Predation is just individuals of one species, predators, feeding and directly harming individuals of another species, prey. And here we're using predation to both include carnivory and herbivory. So carnivory, predator and prey are animals eating animals. Herbivory, the predator is an animal and the prey is plant or algae. And so when we talk about snails predating on algae, that's the correct use of the word predation, even though snails are herbivorous. They're eating algae. Not all organisms fit neatly in these categories. Some carnivores, like wolves, will eat berries, nuts, and leaves. We can talk about omnivores, but you would still typically define a wolf as a predator or a carnivore. They just happen to eat a smaller amount of plants, and there's some vice versa examples as well. And so we tend to kind of put things in one of those two categories. There's parasitism. A predator, the parasite, lives symbiotically on or in its prey, its host, and consumes certain tissues. It may not kill the host. In some parasites, pathogens cause disease. And there's parasitoids. Parasitoids, which I think is kind of a funny term. These are insects that lay eggs on or in another insect host. After hatching, larvae remain in the host, which they eat and usually kill the prey. Kind of a disgusting thing. A cool example of that are the tarantula hawks that they paralyze a tarantula, drag it back into a nest, lay an egg in it, and that egg hatches and then eats its way through the tarantula while it's still alive, but in this state of torpor. And people have been able to show that if they can separate the tarantula wasp from the tarantula before the egg is laid, the tarantula will actually awaken and survive. It takes like a week. It's kind of a crazy one. And here's some examples. For carnivory, they have a carnivorous plant. This is a Cape sundew, but we're all familiar with Venus flytraps, the same sort of idea. An herbivore, giraffe eating leaves, and then this is a pretty profound example of a marine isopod parasite that attaches to the feeding on the tissues of a host. So you can actually see another one over here. So this poor little fish has these two giant isopods chewing on it. There's another cool one that, pretty disgusting one I've seen before, where it's same thing as an isopod. There's a lot of parasitic isopods. And it chews the tongue of a fish and then it replaces the fish. And so I've actually caught fish where you open up its mouth and it looks like a tongue, but it's in fact this isopod that's eaten away the fish's tongue and now is acting as the tongue and sucking, resources from the fish. So parasites do some pretty nasty stuff. Here's a parasitoid. So here's a wasp depositing an egg in an aphid, and then that larva will grow up in the aphid, slowly eating the aphid from the inside out until it's dead, and then it'll metamorphose into one of these wasps. Kind of nasty stuff. Carnivores kill their prey. Herbivores usually don't kill the plants they eat. Of course, there's exceptions to that. But, generally, we're talking about carnivores. They usually don't just take the lynx. Don't take a little bite out of the hair. They typically eat the whole thing. Animal prey are animal prey can usually move or hide from the predators, but plants can't. So we look at the defenses against predation differently in animals from plants, because most animals can move. Some can't. A barnacle stuck to a rock is not going to be able to move from a predatory sea star, but generally animals can move away. And plant prey are often more abundant but have a lower nitrogen content and are less nutritious than animal prey. Yeah, the next slide has this. So this is nitrogen content by dry weight. So nitrogen's a way of looking at energy, and we have xylem and phloem sap. Some leaves and seeds will have more nitrogen compared to the sap of the plant, but the highest nitrogen content's typically in animals. So if you're going for most nutrition per unit mass, eating animals is more efficient than eating plants. Optimal foraging and diet preferences depend on encounter rate. If low, predators, carnivores, should be generalists, meaning if you're a predator and you happen upon something you can eat, you will eat it, as opposed to saying, no, I prefer a slightly different type of prey, so I'm going to pass on a scarce resource in hopes for a better one. And handling time of prey are easy to find, but handling time is long, i.e. Immobile but less nutritious plants than predators, herbivores, should be specialists. So this is saying that if you're an herbivore and there's a whole bunch of plants out there, but if you can adapt to specializing on a single source, a type of nut or a certain type of plant, that you can thereby maybe decrease your handling time and kind of hone in on that, and it occurs in patches, it would make more sense to specialize in having both the biology and physiology to quickly consume that plant and digest it efficiently, so that you're more likely to specialize because you have the opportunity through selection to specialize on a certain type of prey plants that likely exist in large abundance or in patches that you can hang out in. Most carnivores are generalists. They eat prey in relationship to the availability without showing a preference for any particular prey. Some carnivores show a preference, i.e. e.g. lynx eat more hares than they would expect based on the abundance. So this is saying, if you imagine a conveyor belt, or you go to like Belt Sushi, and there's just not a lot on it, something comes by every 10 minutes, you're likely to take it because, that's the only thing coming around, and, you're only seeing one dish every 10 minutes. But if you go to Belt Sushi and the belt's pretty full, then you can start to select for the ones that you like the best. Here it would be based on capture rate and efficiency for honing in on one type of animal, and kind of altering your behavior to be more efficient at that prey. This is an interesting example of, it's a guppy here, and this is a one-to-one relationship, the red line, and the blue line is to follow worms. And so what we'll do is we'll start off here where the percentage of prey that are worms are 20%, but they only constitute 10% of the fish's diet. When there's 40% of the prey are worms, it constitutes about 30% of the diet. And then when 60% of the prey are worms, it constitutes 78% of the diet. And then when there's 80% of the prey are worms, then it's almost 100%. It's 95% of the diet. And so this is showing that guppies are concentrating on whatever is most abundant. And so when worms are a relatively low percentage, they'll eat them, but not necessarily move to disproportionately seeking out worms. Where once they hit some threshold, it's more efficient for them to just focus on eating worms, to focus on, picking up on their cues, changing their behavior, seeking out locations where these worms exist, because you can specialize then in just this one type of prey, presumably reduce your handling time and your searching time. And if they're a nutritious food source, then just specializing on that when they're in great abundance makes sense. When they're in marginal abundance, then perhaps specializing on something else and then picking them up kind of as you encounter them, it makes sense. You can, again, kind of think back to it. It was like the belt sushi analogy. If every 10 dishes is something that you like, you might pick something out that you like less, and then what you really want, whatever it is, spicy crab roll goes by and you're like, oh man, I already got my dish. Where if, spicy crab rolls are the majority going around, then you can just pick those and skip out on the California rolls or whatever is your least preferred sushi prey. Most herbivores are specialists. Large herbivores may eat all above ground parts. Most specialize on particular parts: limbs, leaves, stems, roots, seeds, or sap. Leaves are commonly eaten because they're often the most abundant and nutritious part, with the exception of seeds. But again, seeds typically don't occur year-round. But you can think about what's in a leaf. It's all that photosynthetic biomass, which has a lot of nitrogen in it. And so the leaf is actually a pretty nutritious part compared to like the stems and things like that. Herbivores can reduce the growth and survival and reproduction of plants. Below ground herbivores have an impact. So a 40% reduction in the growth was observed in bush lupines after 3 months of herbivory by root-killing ghost moth caterpillars. That's quite the name here. I'm a root-killing ghost moth caterpillar. But they can have a pretty big impact below the ground. We frequently don't think of that, right? We think of like the bunnies and deer running around our yard, more so than the root predators. This is kind of an interesting one of looking at the distribution of species. This is for a leaf miner fly, and looking at the number of species that focus on one plant or many plants. And so if we look across, there's, what's the total? 200 and some, I want to say. Of this entire distribution, the majority focus on one plant. This is, so 150 plus species of the roughly, I forget, it's like 200 and something species focus on one plant. Far less focus on 2, 3, 4, etc. And then there's one species that will eat 20 plus numbers of plant species. And so the majority of these, although they're highly related, the majority have adapted to really focusing on one type of plant. And then there's other herbivores like grasshoppers. They'll eat a wide variety of species. And then large browsers such as deer will often switch based on seasonal availability. So they'll eat like aspens? No. What are those trees? Oh my gosh. Alder. They'll eat alder leaves for a while. Around here there's like orchards, so they'll eat apples or certain types of grass. So they'll kind of hone in on different things. But in general, they eat a wide variety of plants throughout the year. And kind of seasonally switch based on abundance. Many carnivores forage by moving about in search of prey: wolves, sharks, hawks. Others remain in one place and attack prey when they come within striking distance: more eels, some snakes. Others traps like spider webs, or the modified leaves of carnivorous plants. So they have different strategies that all have different energetic costs associated with them, and presumably different encounter rates. Snakes can detach their jaw to consume prey, quite large prey. If we could do this, we could swallow a watermelon, which I guess would be cleaner, but kind of gross. Cheetahs have quick bursts of speed to catch gazelles, and so these different physical features are related to capturing prey items. Some predators subdue their prey with poison. Others use mimicry to blend in with the environment so the prey are unaware of their presence. And some have inductible traits such as a ciliate that adjust the size to match the size of their allowable prey. Some predators can detoxify or tolerate chemicals of the prey. This is kind of an interesting example of gardener snakes that can eat toxic rough-skinned newts that produce a tetrodotoxin, which is a potent neurotoxin that attacks your involuntary nerves and causes paralysis or death. After swallowing a toxic newt, the snake can't move for 7 hours. When it's vulnerable to predation, it may suffer heat stress, but it can still make it through. So probably not its desired prey, but if that's the only prey available, it can deal with that. Hopefully get to a safe spot to hide out for a while. Adaptations to being eaten can include physical size, large elephants, rapid movement, gazelles, and so co-evolving with a fast predator makes you want to be a faster prey. Or body armor, snails, or this is a pangolin, but you can think of armadillos as well. The same sort of idea. Turtles, having body armor. There's also warning color, aposematic. This is where predators learn not to eat organisms that have toxins. So frequently, we don't have as much around here, but like in tropical waters or tropical forests, like anything that's bright, just stay away from it. We'll talk about things that are bright that aren't toxic, but generally if somebody's showing off, it means that they're not worried about being eaten. And so in this case, a sea slug or a nudibranch can have toxins. They can either accumulate toxins from the algae they eat, or some of them move nematocysts from sea anemones into their skin and then have those stinging cells within them. There's cryptis, i.e. camouflage, able to hide against the background to reduce detection. And there's mimicry, and so these are organisms that are not toxic, but they look like ones that are. And so again, bright coloration is generally a symbol of either toxic or pretending to be toxic, one of the two. Unless you know the difference, generally if you see something bright, just don't pick it up or eat it. Many prey species change their behavior when predators are present. We talked about foraging in open areas with the elk example, making defensive circles to reduce predation by wolves or other such predators. This is kind of an interesting one. So this is a distribution of 4 different snail species, and this is the handling time, basically, for crabs. And so if a crab picks up Littorina, which is, ours are mostly black, but Littorina is it's a high tide snail. They're really, really small. They have thin shells. And so if a crab picks it up, it takes a very minimal amount of time for it to crush it and eat it, compared to Gibula. This one here is a thicker shell. If a crab picks it up, it takes a long time for it to handle and eat it. So as a crab, you're going to go for the ones that have the smallest handling time, right? Optimal foraging theory. If you have 2 nuts in front of you, one takes 2 seconds to open and the other one takes 2 minutes to open, you're going to eat the nut that takes 2 seconds to open. So because of that, when predators are present, in this case crabs, Littorina run and hide. the thick-shelled snails will hang out longer and feed. So generating a thick shell has an energetic cost to both calcifying that much shell and then carrying it around. When waves crash, you've got more mass, and so you have to hold onto the rock harder. All of these things are costs. And here the benefit is when a crunchy predator comes by and wants to squish you, you're tougher, so you can stay out and feed longer. So it's a trade-off there, and it's kind of like an arms race as well. You can be speedy and quick. When predators come, you can run and hide, miss out on the feeding opportunities, or you can be bulky and slow. When predators come by, you can just keep eating away, knowing that you're just too much to deal with, and hopefully they'll go eat some of your thin-shelled relatives. Plant defenses, some produce huge numbers of seeds in some years and hardly any in other years. It's called masting. It's really similar to, I mentioned this for coral reefs. They'll do the same thing where everybody spawns at the same time. You can think about, a stand of trees. If they produce the same number of, in this case, let's say a stand of oaks, if they produce the same number of acorns every year, the acorn predators would kind of normalize to that and presumably eat almost all the acorns. Where instead, if they just produce 10 times as many acorns once every 10 years, one, you won't have the standing stock of acorn predators, and then two, those be so many acorns that even if predators are switching to eating acorns, you hope just to swamp them out. You just have so many acorns that they just can't eat them all, and so some of them will survive. So it's a way of hedging your bets. And plants can hide in time from seed-eating herbivores and overwhelming them by sheer numbers. And so that's generally what we mean by that is instead of having the same production every year and predators getting used to that production, just doing a huge seed, a huge reproductive event, and hopefully swamping out the predators. Some plants have adaptive growth responses to allow them to tolerate herbivory. This is compensation, so when part of the plant's removed, it stimulates new growth. This can result in full compensation, meaning there's no net loss of plant tissue. Depends on the growing season and if it occurs in the right growing season or not. But removal of leaves can decrease self-shading, and removal of atypical buds allows lower buds to open and grow. And so you can think about a plant with a thick canopy. Ultimately, it's light limited. And so if you kind of shear off the top, now it's letting more light penetrate down to the lower leaves that may not have been operating at their full photosynthetic capacity. So you can effectively remove amount of the biomass, some of the leaves, and not impact the photosynthetic capacity of that plant because a lot of the lower leaves were not at 100% capacity. You could think about it as having like a layer of solar panels where you've got a solar panel overlapping a lower one. If you knock off the front one, the top one, then now that lower one's getting more light. In this case, that energy can then be put into increased growth. And here's a study of a plant where they clipped and they cropped some and didn't crop some of them to look at how many fruits they produced, kind of the end measure of productivity. They had a control that they didn't clip. They clipped some on July 12th, some on July 20, and some on July 28, showing that if they clipped them before a certain date, the plant could compensate by, in this case, spreading out. So instead of just being a single stalk, it realizes, hey, I'm under attack, and so it starts putting off increased shoots in different directions, maybe increasing its, in this case, area, so photosynthetic capacity as well, and in fact producing more fruits. But if that happens too late, then the plant can't compensate, and it'll have a lower overall growth and reproduction. Many plants have structural defenses, tough leaves, spines, thorns, saw-like edges, pernicious, nearly invisible hairs that can pierce the skin. Some have inducible defenses that are produced in response to an herbivore attack. and this is an example of cacti producing a spine after being grazed. So producing, whether it's a spine or sometimes a toxin, there's a cost to that. And so if you're in an environment where you're not being predated on, that nobody's coming to chew on your leaves, why waste the energy of making a defense? Where if you start to detect herbivory, then you can make that defense to reduce that herbivory. So having that inducible defense is a way of kind of hedging your bets. If you're in a good environment with low predation, focus all your energy on growth and reproduction. If you're in an area that you're likely to get predated on, then allocate some of your resources towards defense. There's chemical defenses. There's secondary compounds, toxic chemicals that are used to reduce herbivory. Those compounds compounds that attract predators and parasitoids, predators or parasitoids that will attack on the herbivores. So that's kind of a trick of attracting the predators of your predator. It's like the enemy of my enemy is my friend sort of thing. And some are produced all the time, and others are, like I mentioned, induced. Plant defenses can also be overcome by herbivores. Some herbivores have digestive enzymes that allow them to tolerate plant toxins, and this can provide an abundant food source that other herbivores can't eat. And so what we're looking at is like a series of arms races, like you're nutritious and delicious, so I'm going to eat you. Well, now you're going to make a toxin that makes you unedible, and then there's some selection to individuals that have an enzyme that can overcome that toxin, and so now they're able to forage in this patch that nobody else is, so they have a selective advantage, and then the plant will come up with something else, and then the animal will have to come up with something else. This is kind of a crazy one. So this leaf, if it's bit off, it shoots out this resin that will cover the caterpillar, either deter it or kill it. So the caterpillar figured, well, if I just go along and like nip the kind of the main, what's the best word for that? They're calling it canal, but the main sort of pathway for that resin, if I just go along and nip it a couple times, it'll reduce the pressure in here so it can't shoot out this resin and kill me. So I'll just go along, nip it, basically removing its defense. I'll do this slowly over about an hour. Then once this leaf is defenseless, they can eat the whole thing in about 20 minutes. So it's kind of a cool arms race there. Given the variety of anti-herbivore defenses, herbivory must exert strong selection pressure on plant populations. To test this, Zust et al. Looked at the impact of aphids on 5 generations of Arabidopus. 27 varieties of Arabidopus represented the full diversity of chemical defenses. And so this is a plant that's frequently used in genetic studies and these kind of laboratory-based studies. And so they were able to get this diverse genotypic diversity of this plant that have different defensive compounds, expose them to aphids and see what would happen. And so initially the aphids reduced the biomass by quite a lot, and then over time the plants were able to compensate, produce defenses to reduce herbivory and increase their biomass over a number of generations. And through this study they lost about 10 genotypes that just didn't have the right defenses for the predators that they presented them with, these 2 aphid species. So they can adapt through time for that. Okay, that's the end of plants. I'll upload this and then do the next 2 sections here.